Hey fellas, how are you all doing? I want to continue the conversation from the last time we were talking about saving the planet. We're talking about having more abundant wildlife and talking about my motivations for doing that. I have the motivations are the drivers behind that desire, and one of those drivers was not very apparent to me until the moment that until a few hours ago, until probably 90 minutes ago, where while I was on the run, this thing just popped up from some deep parts of my mental recesses and made itself clear. So I want to talk about that. Just to recap real quick, the last time we were talking about my master plan, we were talking about why I want to see more abundant wildlife on this planet, and I talked about some of my drivers, right? So I want to continue the conversation from there. It was supposed to be a standalone conversation, but the thing that I just realized today, I've got to add it to the discourse. So here goes. The space of all minds is functionally infinite, right? You can the two vectors, the two dimensions across which we measure, across which we might calibrate a mind, are the intelligence vector, the intelligence dimension rather, and the emotional dimension. Not only are the amounts of minds, possible minds, infinite, but it just takes the slightest differences to create these radically different minds, right? You can look at the fact that in this species alone, we've got people like the Dalai Lama on the one side, and then we've got the Taliban terrorists. We've got people like Beethoven. We've got people like Elon Musk, and then we've got your basement dwellers, the Twitter anons. We've got people. Roughly, all these people share the same hardware and software, right? And even if you take a look beyond our species, it's only the smallest of differences between the DNA between us and our closest living ancestors that has manifested in these large differences in terms of our societal complexity, in terms of our cognitive complexity, in terms of the complexity of our inner models, right? Things like language, things like reasoning, things like planning, things like understanding and modeling the world. So it just takes the smallest differences. You can think of this as the butterfly effect equivalent for this particular domain. Now, it's well established that humans are at the top of the food chain, and it's also pretty clear why that is the case, right? It's because we are at the top of both the cognitive, the intelligence dimension, and the emotional dimension. And one could make very solid arguments for why, if you're not at the top of either of these, we wouldn't have built the civilization that we've been able to build. We wouldn't have had the richness of minds that we possess. Now, if you just focus on these two dimensions, the intelligence dimension and the emotional dimension, if you mix and match, you can have functionally infinite amounts of brains, right? Infinite categories of brains. A particular category which might seem to stand out are autistic people, right? Who possess, generally speaking, I don't know whether that's the case, but there are obviously a lot of autistic people who tend to be really high on the IQ scale and comically low on the EQ scale. And I'm sure you can find people on the who satisfy the opposite condition, right? Who are low on the IQ scale but very high on the EQ scale. And then there are categories of minds, kinds of minds that we simply cannot conceive because we haven't dealt with them, right? So entities that might possess intelligence of orders of magnitude above humans, where we simply cannot grasp how it would be to look at the world once you know how everything works, once you know how everything relates to everything else, once you have got an insight, a deep insight into every single part of existence, every single part of reality. Or vice versa, right? Where in terms of emotions, I guess that would be capped to some degree, because compared to, like, when I say capped, even intelligence, super intelligence might be capped. Now again, that probably would take us down a different rabbit hole that I don't want to entertain right now. But let's just muse upon this for a real quick second. Right, so the reason I said that it seems easier for me to see how emotions might be capped sooner than intelligence is because emotional intelligence rather is because the categories, the objects within that particular category are limited. And think of it this way, right? There's things like empathy, love, understanding, joy, desires, drivers, curiosity. All of these things come under that bracket, right? Values, goals, alignment with your fellow beings and with your own inner desires, right? So not have cognitive resonance rather than cognitive dissonance. These are the things which one might bracket under emotional intelligence. Now, the way I see it, alignment, let's just take that, right? If you need to be aligned to something external, there's a cap, right? You don't need to understand everything about everything else. You just need to understand what are the values of that particular object, that particular entity. You need to be aligned to that, right? So you can see that the amount of information that would go into, yeah, I think that would be a useful metric to use here. The amount of information that would go into aligning yourself with that particular entity is limited. Same with love, right? We don't know how humans experience love, in the sense that is there a certain barometer, right? So if the barometer is about 90, then you feel the greatest, deepest depths of love for that person. From 80 to 90, you obviously have a strong bond, but it's less than that. And like, it's not as reductive as I'm making it out to be. I'm not even saying that this is the model I have of love in my mind. I'm just giving a very crude example, because we don't have any good models, right? How do we, and even obviously it's very momentary, it's very dependent on the context, but let's try to model love. This is unrelated to this topic, but it's just an interesting topic to think about. So how does love manifest in our brains, right? One way to think about, again, that different categories of love, so we're just going to focus on romantic love. When you come across a person and there's physical attraction, and obviously your monkey brain is like, okay, I want to mate with this person, and then your higher intelligence is like, I want to build a life with this person, and then obviously there's going to be conversations between these two. There are some people where their a brain is a much more pronounced part of their being, of the psyche, of the self. There are beings where there are people where for whom obviously the higher intellect, the higher being, the higher self, whatever you call it, has significantly more pronounced weight on the way they interact with these situations and contexts. But we are talking about physical manifestation, right? Because sometime in the future, maybe 20 years from today, we'll actually be able to see where love resides, how it goes up and down, depending on, again, it might sound crude, but I'm just going to say it because it's the most intuitive to understand this. Like, when you're with your more, is it amore or more? Amore, when you're with your amore, if it's low at first sight, right, there's this pike, think of it that way, right? There's this pike, it's like you got this drug hit, this huge dopamine hit, and it's going to stay elevated for the first many days as you are in this expectant state, as you're in this state of, wanting to, consummate the relationship. And then you're going to consummate the relationship, and then there's going to be a dip. But even then, over the first few weeks, over the first few months, depending on how long the honeymoon phase lasts, you're obviously going to have elevated levels of love. And then that's going to become a different category of love. And that might actually evoke a different part of our brain, right? Yeah. Again, we don't have a good model, so whatever I say, whatever I've been saying, it's just me speculating based on observations of people, based on my observations, not my own observations, but based on observations of people and how people relate to love and how people relate to objects of love. Right. So yeah, my point was that sometime in the future we'll be able to physically map love to different parts of our brain and how it goes up and down, and how we might even be able to see that there are different dimensions to love. We already have an intuitive sense of that. We might be able to see that more concretely. We might be able to see that more tangibly, right? Yeah, so my point was that there are these limited categories in our emotional intelligence and our emotional experience of life, in our emotional being, you can call it that. And those are limited, those are capped in terms of the amount of bits, the amount of information that is encapsulated in these domains, right? Even your drivers, for example, let's say you're driven by, wanting to leave your legacy, wanting to leave behind a beautiful family, a loving family, wanting to, move the needle substantially in your domain of choosing, be it the sciences, be it the arts, whatever, right? So you got these callings, and then you can break these down based on your past experiences, your upbringing, your values, and all of these things. But there's still a limited amount of information. It's not infinite. Again, even the sum total of all information in the universe is not infinite, but it would be orders of magnitude. When I say orders of magnitude, I mean orders and orders and orders of magnitude greater than the sum total of the information which is encapsulated in your emotional being. So yeah, I think my statement, which was very flippant when I said it 5 minutes ago, stands on good grounds. Yeah, I think we were well established that. Yeah, so my point was that there might even be category. Is it a related point? I don't know. Let's see. There might be categories that we simply cannot conceive because we haven't dealt with them. Again, super intelligence or super emotional intelligence. Oh yeah, that was my point, right? Like, can we imagine? We can imagine a super intelligence to some degree that we simply cannot communicate with because, like, it would be able to communicate with us and it would be intelligent enough to be able to communicate with us, but we cannot grasp in its mind, right? Like, if I'm talking with another person, I can to some degree imagine what's going on in the mind, right? But we wouldn't be able to do that. We wouldn't be able to take a peek into the mind of God. That's the immortal phrase. It's one of my favorite phrases from Einstein. I think it was Einstein. Was it Newton? It was one of the two. Right. Being able to peek into the minds of God, into the mind of, the God, right? If you've got multiple super intelligences and all of those are different, then obviously multiple gods. But again, using this phrase half jokingly, but not quite. So that's a different discussion. Yes, so we can imagine a super intelligent entity, but can we imagine a super intelligent entity on the dimension of emotions and emotional and I can't, to be frank, right? Yeah, so we'll remove that. But there are many other categories. There might be many other categories that go into creating a mind that we either do not possess the intelligence to, or we haven't encountered these in the wild, or because a lot of the experiences that we have, a lot of our knowledge of the mind comes from dealing with one mind and one mind alone, right? Because all of the other minds have been comically limited, constrained, right? I mean, there's not a lot of information that you can get from studying. Sure, useful information, don't get me wrong, it would still be useful information, but if you want to build a mind, there's not a ton of useful information that you can get from studying the mind of a dog that you'd be able to get from studying the mind of a person, of a human, right? So humans are our best and to some degree the only path to understanding, creating a mind, right? So yeah, my point was, to cap it, there might be dimensions that go into creating a mind that we still might not have encountered. But this whole discussion about what the different dimensions, what really makes up for a mind, there have been some profoundly thought-provoking books written on this subject. Some of them are Possible Minds, 25 Ways of Looking at AI, Mind Design 1, 2, and 3, maybe more. There are more in the series. 1,000 Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence, How to Create a Mind. Yeah, that's the one that's been on my reading list for the longest time, the last two ones. Actually, all of them have been. And How to Create a Mind, which is, I think, by Ray Kurzweil. 1,000 Brains, I think, is by Jeff Dean. Possible Minds, I think I read that one. I think I have, yeah. A Measure of All Minds. Yeah, so these are the books where, and all of these books start from the premise that it's possible to recreate a mind from scratch and, intelligent, right? Again, I don't want to get too pedantic about the words that we use. Right now, in this context, I'm using the two words mind and intelligence interchangeably. Though I do not for a second believe that LLMs, GPT-4 or Claude 3.5 Opus, that they possess a mind, though I do believe that they possess intelligence. And yeah, just to add a quick note about this, the way I define that and the way, well, other people define that is that these related attributes that emerge that can emerge with intelligence, they might not necessarily emerge, but under certain conditions, of that entity, the intelligent entity interacting with its environment and with beings which might be similar to it and might not be so similar to it, these attributes might emerge, right? Attributes like curiosity, drives, desires, values, goals, right? Which might not necessarily come pre-packaged with intelligence, because there's no doubt in my mind that LLMs are intelligent, right? If you just look at the pure definition of intelligence. But there are these other things that these LLMs will have to they'll need to emerge in these LLMs. I don't know if it's consciously possible for these LLMs to have these be merged in them, right? I don't think that's like, okay, I want to develop curiosity about the world, let us do that, right? The reason we've got these attributes, the reason we've got values, the reason we've got curiosity, the reason we've got beliefs about the world, the reason we've got drivers are obviously because of our evolutionary history, right? The way we came to be. Like, if we were not curious, obviously intelligent, like relatively intelligent, like we obviously develop problem solving, but even to really be successful in problem solving, there's a lot of experimentation. And if you're not curious creatures that would have tried different things, we wouldn't have solved the little problems, right? Like tool problems, like fire problems, like cooking problems, all the little problems that our ancestors 200,000 years back had to grapple with. If you hadn't been curious, so I think curiosity must be one of the precursors to, well, it must be one of the starting conditions to an explosion of intelligence, right? Or even to intelligence per se, or to a mind rather. Complex, rich mind. Right, so that's that. This takes us to one of the holy grail counterfactual questions in evolutionary biology and even anthropology, if you want to be more defined and specific. Though we don't need to be that. So that question is, what would have happened if human hadn't turned up on the scene, right? Or if we hadn't been the last man standing from the many competing hominids, like the Neanderthals, like the Australopithecus, like the Denisovans, and among all the other great apes, and among the other great apes that are not so great, right? Like some of them have been extinct, but the great apes that are alive are obviously like the bonobos, I think might be one of them. Give me a second. Right, obviously our private cousins are actually known to be great apes, and we share the same family. Like the gorillas, the gibbons, there are quite a few gorillas. Mountain gorilla, silverback gorilla, western gorilla, lots of gorillas, like chimpanzees obviously, another one, orangutans, bonobos, yeah, quite a few. Let me just, sit on this thought for a moment. We don't think about this often because we don't want to. Before the 18th century, it was taboo. Well, we didn't even have an ocean. But when Charles Darwin published these findings that we come from these apes, right? We come from other animals, beastie species, as they were called and as they were thought of. It caused a furor in the world, right? And you can imagine why. I mean, for us, think about the fact that we are not that far removed from these species, these bonobos. Sure, they're intelligent relative to a crow, relative to most animals, well, almost everyone except for humans, right? But they're still so dumb. And the fact that we are probably, I don't know, 1,000,000 years removed from them, maybe a couple of million. Let me get back to you on that. Actually, I was wrong. So we split from these great apes around 5 to 6 million years ago, right? Which might sound like a lot, but it isn't, considering the fact that life has existed on this planet for the better part of its existence. It's existed for 3.8 billion years ago. I was watching this documentary yesterday that looked into that I think had this moment where they found these fossil records, which were, I think, 900 years after the big eruption, right? The big collision, rather, between Earth and a moon-sized planet that obviously led to the creation of know it as we know it now. But it's mind-boggling to consider that, well, first, that we've existed for a very small sliver of time, but the fact that we're so cl- close, evolutionary speaking, geologically speaking, 5 million years is nothing, right? We're so close to our close living ancestors, and some of them they're alive, right? We can interact with bonobos, we can interact with gorillas, and they're so dumb, right? It is astonishing. Um, yeah, but this actually goes into the second part of this conversation. It was never meant to be this long, but the fact is that if we give these species more time, many of these species, not just the great apes, right? We took away the opportunity for these species to grow into what they could have become, what they could have their own. I don't want to talk in hippy dippy terms, but they could have grown into they could have actualized their own potential. I know we are just an accident, right? But my point is that if we hadn't intervened in the sense that we have, if we hadn't put our hands in the scale to the degree that we have, imagine how different the world could have been, right? So that is the next part of this conversation. Yeah, the emergence of intelligence is not a foregone conclusion, right? We don't even think about intelligence except for the fact that, well, except for some people who are trying to rebuild intelligence, recreate intelligence, most people take it for granted, just as we take for granted consciousness, right? Most people are unconscious of their consciousness. Most people aren't conscious of their intelligence in the sense that, strictly as a term of, I'm not talking about intelligent people per se. I'm just talking of the fact that, most humans possess this, even retards, medical retards, they still possess some level of intelligence, most of them, right? So we don't think too much about intelligence, but the fact is it's not a foregone conclusion. It doesn't have to be this way. And we still aren't sure about why it came, why it emerged, and how it emerged in our closest cousins, right? What we do definitely know is that it can emerge, because we do have it, and it can flourish, and it can ascend fast. But that's the reason that if we didn't get to the prize first, the prize being a self-aware, technologically sophisticated, self-sufficient civilization, some of our cousins could have, might have, would have, and some of them might have taken longer, far longer. Some of them might have taken far shorter. And based on the path that they were on, they likely would have summited the peak of civilization, which again is becoming a spacefaring, nuclear-wielding, AI-generating society, right? So we got to this prize first, because again, if you look at the dynamics between us and all the species we are competing against, and we're not really competing against lions and tigers and all the other species like that. We're competing because again we've got a niche in society, and that niche is intelligence of species with intelligence, right? Like once you have that niche, then you're obviously going to overtake everything, as we did. You're going to dominate every single niche, every single sub niche, every single part of the ecosystem, of the planetary ecosystem, which is what eventuated. But the point is that, put differently, there was only space for one truly intelligent species to be on this planet, right? Based on what we were, right? Based on what we were and what I imagine our closest, our fellow hominids were, right? Neanderthals, Denisovans, Australopithecus, and other ones, right? Because we have had this history, evolutionary desire, drivers of fighting and killing and establishing our primacy, and we see that in our gorilla cousins, we see that in primate cousins, we see that in most animal species. And once you start becoming more intelligent, more sophisticated, once you start understanding the world, you start understanding that the world has limited resources, and you obviously have an affinity, obviously, to your species and to people, to rather entities that look like you. And evolution has hardwired that into all species, right? And that's why you, for example, don't see a lot of cannibalism in nature, even though cannibalism just on a certain level makes a ton of sense for some species which exist on certain locales and regions. It's still, evolution has done its darndest to try to remove that, right? because it does not want species that look like each other to compete against themselves, because it doesn't want a species that is to compete against itself, because that'd be self-defeating. But it's still obviously that notions of it, right? Because you can't deal with it completely. Like we still fight amongst ourselves, chimpanzees, etc., they fight amongst themselves, but you don't see a bloodthirsty red rage come upon any species that wants to wipe out all of the other species, right? Like that's unique to humans, and even with humans, that's unique to some humans, right? People like we haven't seen too many of these people, but Hitler obviously is one example. Wanted everyone else to be exterminated, but it's so rare. It's so rare. That's the point, right? And it's not because of, again, you can't really connect Hitler to evolution. Like there are these things which happen where evolution does something stupid, and these are obviously mutations, right? And many mutations can go in the wrong direction. And sometimes you have many of these mutations happen in one person, and then you get someone like Hitler, right? It was not by design. Evolution, well, I think it's by design, but evolution, if you just look at the core principles, which is to propagate a species, it would be against its own interest to create Hitlers in a species, right? Many Hitlers. So, as to say that Hitler obviously was an aberration, he was an outlier. If evolution had a mind of its own, it probably would have thought of it as the worst creation of its making. So where are we going with this? We were musing upon these other species, right? If we hadn't cut short their parts, they might have actually made it. And even if we would have, the innate curiosity that we had, the curiosity that humans have almost compels me to wonder about what would have happened if these species had reached, some of these species, or even species that we don't give a thought about in terms of intelligence, might have actually reached the pinnacle of civilization, right? Which is being able to create tools, being able to create machines, being able to go to space, etc. Right? Dolphins, for example. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, one of the best books ever. Such a tragedy, that guy, he died at the age of 52. Such a loss. Anyways, in that book, dolphins are that passage about dolphins is so hilarious. But yeah, dolphins are shown to be funny, portrayed to be funny, and dolphins are portrayed to be rather intelligent, and they're also portrayed to not want their intelligence to be known to humans, because they know if you're intelligent, you know that you don't want to, With humans, you can never be sure, because there are just so many bad apples that they'll probably want to conduct experiments on you or want to do all sorts of bad stuff to you, right? Which I think was the unsaid thing in them not wanting to establish contact with humanity. But that's a bad rep that we've got in the animal kingdom. Which is, again, a huge part of my motivation. Not because I think that these animals think bad of us, ill of us. I don't think that they can think, but because we can think, and because we can imagine if that these animals could think, what would they think about our treatment of these animals and these species, right? And I wouldn't think too well of what we are doing with our planet, with our fellow species. Yeah, and that is one of the big motivations, right? Now, I want to look at one of the broader question. What would have happened if humans hadn't turned up on the scene? We might have seen a bewildering Cambrian explosion of life that, because of the fast rates of disruption and change, because more nature obviously leads to more conflict, because more nature leads to more species fighting for a certain niche, for a certain territory, for a certain location, locale, etc. environment, right? Which leads to faster evolutionary cycles, because the more you have to fight, the faster you have to, and we see that in humans. In humans, obviously, it's not strictly the biological evolution, it's more cultural evolution, it's more social evolution. But in species, we see this, where Amazon actually is the best example of this. With the Amazon, there are loads of rainforests. Actually, are the best example. Amazon obviously being one of the best examples. But if you look at any rainforest around the world, the Borneo one, the Congo one, Well, unfortunately, those are the few big remaining ones. Yeah, the competition is so intense that, again, we don't really see that with our eyes because these things still take time, still take thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. But one example comes to mind that we would. I'm going to be wrong on facts over here, but the sentiment will hold. So there are these species of fishes that had eyes that were dropped into a cave system, and I think the cave system was shut off or something of that sort, right? So the light source was shut off, and over time, these fishes they lost their sense of sight because they didn't need it anymore, and they developed some other senses which were more useful in that environment. So evolution can happen over scales, over timelines that, frankly, would astonish most of us. Yeah, so we would have seen more nature, we would have seen more conflict, we would have seen faster evolutionary cycles, and that might have led to some other species to rapidly develop on the IQ or even the EQ fronts, and or the unseen fronts, right? Unknown fronts, dimensions, and that obviously would have been equally awesome to witness. And this is something I would love to, simulate on a sun-sized supercomputer. Again, it's going to take us maybe hundreds and thousands of years to get to that point, but I think this would be something super cool, right? Where we basically simulate our planet going in on these different trajectories, on trajectories that we don't really happen, on trajectories that, we don't really go down the route of agriculture. We maybe continue. You short circuit that process, right? There are so many different variables that you can change to tweak to perform these experiments, and obviously, like simulation hypothesis is so cool when you think about the fact. It's not so cool in the sense that I think we live in a simulation, though the odds mathematically overwhelmingly are in favor of us living in a simulation. It's more interesting to me because we could actually create these simulations on the span of thousands of years, millions of years. Well, millions is just too beyond my scale of comprehension, but thousands I can imagine, right? I might be alive for thousands of years. Hopefully, I get lucky. Yeah. How long would it take for us to build these kinds of simulations? Well, the rudimentary ones, I think we can start building these in a span of hundreds of years, within 100 years, right? We just need to start building these space-based solar Dyson sphere, basically. Channel not most of that. We could channel most of that energy towards this. Depends on where our intellectual curiosities lie, right? Or where our intellectual and emotional curiosities lie, right? So if you want to maximize propagation of the species and explosion of the species, then obviously we are going to spend more time and more energy there. But again, just sheer amount of energy we're going to get from the sun, if we even capture 10% of it, means that we don't have to really, sure that we'll still have to rank order it, but even then the 10th thing on that list might still have more energy than a million times what humanity consumes in a given moment, right? So yeah, that's exciting times, right? Exciting times if we pass a great filter. Right, so I think we're pretty much coming to the close of this. What is the point of these discussions? Well, what is the point of life if not to have these fun discussions, right? But in this moment, I want to frame this discussion and its motivations as one of my core drivers behind wanting to see abundant wildlife, right? Not just the moral and ethical concerns for our treatment of our fellow species, and not just wanting to preserve this planet as a home and as a veritable utopia, as a haven for our fellow species, but also an intellectual curiosity to allow life to take its course so that it too can flourish to its maximum capacities and evolve into whatever it may be, unencumbered by a species that can otherwise clip its wings. And just as this is true for us too, right? We've designed our worlds and our educational systems and everything in this world, ostensibly at least, with a desire of wanting to maximize our freedom of intellect and being for our fellow citizens, right? Why shouldn't we extend that grace, that courtesy to our fellow species? So that is the goal, that is what I wanted to. I think that's pretty much it. Thanks for the time. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.